hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode number 111 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this Thursday, late afternoon into early evening in New York. If you're checking out this episode on the YouTube channel or enjoying the content, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, turn on those notifications. Or if you're catching up with episode 111 on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. So today, sadly, marks 25 years since who I believe to be the greatest filmmaker who ever lived passed away. Stanley Kubrick, at age 70, died of a heart attack on this day, 1999. And the general sense was he more or less worked himself to death. And I don't know if the word is ironic, but he was somebody who made relatively few films in his career, but was always working. And unfortunately had a lot of unrealized projects. Now, every filmmaker, you Google Spielberg, Scorsese, Francis Coppola, De Palma, hell, even Christopher Nolan, if you want to go more current, Darren Aronofsky, there are always projects that they either circle or decide they want to make, or something ends up going wrong. To give you perspective, Christopher Nolan, when he was, I don't want to say just starting out, around the time he made, was it Insomnia with Robin Williams and Al Pacino, he wrote a screenplay for a movie about Howard Hughes. Unfortunately for him, Martin Scorsese got there first. And Christopher Nolan never really complained about that. He felt that doing that script and the research and everything was beneficial to his career going forward. But that's an example of what I'm talking about, where you, as a filmmaker, whether you're a young filmmaker charging upwards, as was Christopher Nolan 20 years ago, or an established commodity like a Stanley Kubrick, when you put your body, mind, and soul into a project, and for whatever reason, it doesn't happen, takes a lot out of you. And I feel as if in the case of Stanley Kubrick, it wasn't just that he was working hard to complete Eyes Wide Shut, because every filmmaker works hard. And Francis Coppola, who's in his 80s now, and Scorsese, finishing up Killers of the Flower Moon last year, and Francis Coppola, who's been working on Megalopolis for I don't even know how many years. It shouldn't kill you. But in the case of Kubrick, maybe he didn't take the best care of himself. Maybe he should have taken more trips to the doctor. Nobody really knows. But the story goes that he completed a cut of Eyes Wide Shut. And there's differing reports on whether that was the version we saw in theaters, because there was controversy. There was a version that the MPAA said, we'll have to rate this NC-17 unless you trim certain things and cut this and that, and just a few seconds here or there. But sometimes that's all it takes with the MPAA, as was the case with this movie right here, which was rated X. The MPAA actually, with a straight face, a normal Hollywood private eye film with a sexual component, horror of horrors, simulated sex, OMG, we have to give this an X rating. Sir Alan Parker had to go back and take out 10 seconds to get the MPAA to give it an R rating. And the Siskel and Eberts of the world back then were up in arms here. Like, this is not pornography. This is a serious film for real people. How dare you equate this with pornography? But I digress. Eyes Wide Shut is not pornography. There are scenes of sex. Dare I say moments where we get an idea there might be group sex. Oh my God. What a catharsis. What an incredible thing. Horrible. Can't allow people to see that they might already have seen or done in their regular life. We have to pretend that, come on, it's 25 years ago. And everybody was, woo, we don't know if we can show this in an R-rated movie. But Stanley showed a cut of Eyes Wide Shut to the main cast and crew, and it was a very long shoot. It might hold the record for longest continuous shoot in the history of Hollywood. When Tom Cruise was promoting Jerry Maguire in the fall of 1996, same year that he had Mission Impossible, which, as we know, was the first one, huge hit. A lot of people didn't understand it. Huh? What's a knock list? It's not knock with a K-N-O-C-K. It's knock with an N-O-C. Oh, that helps a lot. It's kinds of conversations people were having in 1996. But while Tom Cruise was promoting Jerry Maguire, a film which ended up being an enormous hit, he was nominated for Best Actor, and I got to tell you, I wanted him to win. Jeffrey Rush is in the movie Shine for maybe 20 minutes, and see, he somehow got Best Actor, and Tom Cruise gives his everything he's got to that role. The title character, Jerry Maguire. But while he was out there, Tom, as always, incredible promoter of himself, of his movies, and of the movie business at large. We saw it last year where he went out of his way to repeatedly tell people to go see Barbie and Oppenheimer, as well as Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning. But Cruise is out there in 96, promoting Jerry Maguire, doing interviews. He had started filming Eyes Wide Shut at that exact time. Not that you would do this. This is the kind of thing that someone like me does when he assesses haircuts and facial hair of certain actors. Well, this is probably shot within a month of that. The Tom Cruise in Eyes Wide Shut, he mostly looks less than a year away from what he appears in Jerry Maguire. See, the first Mission Impossible is it's difficult to judge because his character is kind of beat up and he had a totally different hairstyle. He had the kind of buzz cut in that movie. But Eyes Wide Shut began shooting sometime in the fall of 96. Did not come out until July 30th of 1999. That is a very long window. Nearly 3 years. A lot of production problems on that movie. I'd do a whole podcast episode on Eyes Wide Shut. But the idea was Kubrick showed the film to Tom, Nicole Kidman, and Todd Field, and some of the other members of the cast, Sidney Pollack and the crew. And they were all overjoyed. And that was the last time any of them saw Stanley because he passed the following day or following 2 days, whatever it was. And he did not seem stressed. He didn't appear to be someone who was taking his final bow in real life. Nobody said anything about it. And I remember when the news came out that he had passed, there was a sense of shock. And Cruise immediately came out, and he and Spielberg and Nicole and Tom Hanks and a lot of the real big players in Hollywood went to London for the funeral. And there was just a sense of terrible tragedy because, 70, he lived a full life. He did so much more than almost anyone. So he was somebody who was given intellectual gifts that were not really almost inhuman, but he maximized them. He did so much with his talent. But there was still a sense that he had more to say. And some of those unrealized projects, he was still young enough where he could have gotten them funded. Again, you look at Martin Scorsese shooting and preparing Killers of the Flower Moon, more than a decade older than Stanley was when he passed. And Scorsese, boundless energy on the set of Killers of the Flower Moon. It's such a joy to watch that man work. And Kubrick wasn't that kind of personality. He had a sense of humor, but he was not Scorsese hopping around on a set. Did you get it? Did you get it? Thank you. Thank you. He was not that kind of personality. Or Spielberg with the ever-present little smile that he's famous for, especially when he knows a day went well. Kubrick was different. But he was born Stanley Kubrick in the Bronx. And a little family personal footnote is that my father went to the same high school that Stanley Kubrick attended 14 years later. Stanley, as my dad many years later, skipped a grade in school. So he went to the Bronx High School of Science, which is where my father went. And my dad graduated in 58, and I think Kubrick graduated in 44, but I'm not 100% on that. I'm calculating the years. But Stanley Kubrick, as a child, showed aptitudes indicating a high level of intelligence and problem solving also at a level that was not that of even a normal, very smart person. There were reports that claimed his IQ was 200. Now, nobody really knows that for sure. And even if we did, what does that actually mean? But the general sense is, whatever Stanley Kubrick put his mind to, he was going to be really good at and probably great. So He was a child prodigy, as was Spielberg, but from a slightly different angle, because once young Spielberg began making movies, it was pretty obvious to see that this is what he's going to do. But Stanley Kubrick, unlike Spielberg many years later, 15 to 20 years later, Kubrick started out getting a job, which for someone his age was incredible. He got a job taking pictures for Look magazine, which at the time, circa 1940s, had one of the highest circulations in the country. I think it was a sister publication of Life magazine, if I'm not mistaken. But you look at Kubrick's early work, and there have been galleries, retrospectives, and entire books dedicated to just Stanley Kubrick's photographic achievements. The kid was just magic. And look at some of his work that he recorded when he was 14, 15, 16, in some cases even younger. And you're scratching your head saying, how did he do that? How did he know to do this with the camera? How was he aware that you could actually achieve this with this era of camera? But he was somebody who not only experimented, but his brain was clearly calculating solutions to problems that most people didn't even know existed. He was able to optimize the technology of the day. That is how he did what he did. So he was a star before he got into the movie business. History is thankful that he was able to get into the movie business. And people who worked with him when he was very young, such as Kirk Douglas, there's a lot of information. And as I always say, this is one of the great things about YouTube. Yes, it's funny. You watch shorts and we have some laughs and everything. But there is a lot of Kirk Douglas talking about what it was like working with Stanley Kubrick on, two movies, Paths of Glory and Spartacus. Paths of Glory of 1957. It's an anti-war film. World War I, not World War II. But Kubrick was still in his 20s. And even with that, and understanding that Kirk Douglas lived a very long life, I think that he passed about 6 years ago. He was 100, I think, when he died. He spoke of Stanley in almost reverential tones, which you don't normally get with an older person discussing a younger person in the fashion that he discussed Stanley. But he had enormous respect for not only his artistry, but just how resolute he was and steadfast in his desire to get things the way that he wanted. Now, in Kirk's opinion, Kubrick never abused his casts. Even with, he was famous for shooting take after take after take after take. But an early Stanley Kubrick story on a film that he did just before Paths of Glory called The Killing. Stanley was about 26, so still very young and kind of green, but somebody who knew how to work a movie camera, optimize just as he was able to with 1940s and early 50s era photography equipment. He knew how to get the absolute most out of everything. So the story goes, he was making this movie, The Killing, which is started Sterling Hayden, who he later famously worked with in Dr. Strangelove. Sterling Hayden. I love Sterling Hayden. I should do an episode on Sterling Hayden. What a great actor, a great performer, a character. And he was one of the original choices. Steven Spielberg loved the guy, was going to cast him as Quint. And I don't know if it was that Hayden got sick. Whatever it was, they ended up going with Robert Shaw. And that obviously, nobody's throwing that back because Shaw fucking kills that role. But Stanley was making the movie The Killing with Sterling Hayden, and it's about like a racetrack robbery kind of gone awry. And during the filming, one day when Stanley was going over a couple of the shots, and he pointed out to, I don't remember the guy's name, director of photography, that he told the guy that he was not using the proper filter and the proper frame rate that Stanley wanted for a particular shot. And he was very precise with his wording. He knew exactly what he was talking about. And he wanted the director of photography to understand, I'm not speaking to you in this way because I'm trying to exert authority. This is how I want you to do this. I need you to shoot this particular way. So the director of photography, who was significantly older than Stanley, was a guy who had been around for decades and I think was in his 50s. He did not appreciate being spoken to in this fashion. But bro, you're the DP. The director is the one who is setting it up in almost all cases. Yes, you have a little bit of leeway, but if the filmmaker is telling you exactly what to do with the camera, you listen to him. In this particular instance, the director of photography wasn't having it. Fuck this kid. So he did not exactly do what Kubrick asked for. He made a couple of adjustments, but he did not get it to where Stanley wanted it. I don't think that he believed that Kubrick actually knew what he was talking about when he was giving him all this mumbo jumbo about frame speed and filters and this and that and the other thing. When Stanley, at the end of the day, looked at the dailies, he very quietly said to the guys, words to the effect of, I understand you look at me and you see a kid who should still be in school. That's fair. But if you ever fuck with me again, you're fired. Plain and simple. And that was it. He got what he wanted. And Kubrick was not someone who was known to do that. He was famous for fucking with his casts. But on the crew, it was usually very tight ship because people knew their role. And they also knew, and this is something that you like to see in any business, any professional enterprise, when the person, the captain of the ship, is outworking everybody else. And anybody on a Kubrick film, Tom Cruise would talk about this too, Nicole Kidman, the late great Sidney Pollack, they will all say, nobody worked harder than Stanley. And there is something gratifying to know that you, as somebody, a creative person who is giving their all, the captain of the ship is right there, having your back. To know that you're not just putting out and he's fucking around on his phone or whatever. Not that there's anything wrong with fucking around on your phone if you have some downtime. But the general consensus, when people talk about influential filmmakers whose lives and careers impacted not just the movie business at large, but individual people within the movie business. The two names that you will hear the most, even now, Kubrick is one and Orson Welles is the other. Orson Welles was another guy whose IQ was way above that of a normal, really smart person. Orson Welles figured out also earlier how to optimize 1940s era movie cameras. He figured out certain things with lenses and frame rate and speed and angles that nobody really had even contemplated. I believe that Kubrick now is the most influential filmmaker who ever lived. That there is a greater evidence of his imprint on work of filmmakers of today, such as Christopher Nolan. Absolutely, Christopher Nolan's use of close-ups and the way that he frames close-ups. It's straight out of the Kubrick playbook. And I'll give you another one to be very specific, a movie that many of you have seen, Barbie. You know, I watched the first 40 minutes. Once they got to the real world of film, my brain just kind of shut off. It didn't work for me. Having said that, brilliantly shot. And it's the sort of film, you give all credit to Greta Gerwig, the filmmaker, because it's just not my kind of movie. What she was able to visually achieve, it probably didn't read that well on the page. Like if somebody 5 years ago handed me a copy of, hey, you know that filmmaker that did Lady Bird, whatever it might be, read this script, I would have said, this is fucking stupid. This won't work. How could this possibly work? It's visually unbelievable what they were able to achieve. The movie is just not, it's not my kind of movie. But that's beside the point. The moment very early in the film where they are discussing the history of the doll. And you have a bunch of kids playing with dolls in what looks like prehistoric times, but it's not prehistoric times. That is, well, to call it an homage to Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, the opening sequence of, are they like ape men? Neanderthal men? I'm not really sure what they're supposed to be. But that the framing of that in Barbie is identical. The thing where they throw the doll up into the air and this and that and the other thing, it's the same shots, the same sequence of shots from Stanley Kubrick's 2001. That is not an accident. That is a moment in the movie that the reality is most people, especially if they're under 40, will not realize they're watching a moment that is for people like me to say, hey, look at that, she's doing 2001: A Space Odyssey. For that alone, Greta Gerwig should have gotten an Oscar nomination for mirroring it so beautifully and not really pandering to the audience, because most people are not going to get the joke. They're not going to get the reference. But Kubrick, if I'm asked the question, and obviously I'm not going through movie by movie, today is a sad day of remembrance because he was such an extraordinary talent and wanted to put more into the world than he was able to. Ridley Scott just made a Napoleon film. Kubrick had an unrealized Napoleon project that he had worked on. He had a project called The Aryan Papers, based on a novel by, I believe, the same novelist who wrote About Schmidt. I don't remember the name of the novelist. You know what? I'm going to look that up. And the reason why Stanley ended up not making The Aryan Papers was because Spielberg and Scorsese were trying to figure out which one of them was going to direct Schindler's List. I know that sounds wacky, but Marty got the script first, and he gave it to Spielberg. See, Hollywood is, I don't want to say it's weird. We know it's weird. But sometimes it's a matter of which director is hottest at a particular moment in history, who gets what script first. And Scorsese could have directed Schindler's List, but he was never going to make that movie. He would say, it's not my story to tell. That's neither here nor there. But Kubrick was preparing this movie called The Aryan Papers, and he pulled what he was doing. I think the name of the author was, I was thinking of a different story. I was thinking of an author by the name of Louis Begley who wrote About Schmidt. The Aryan Papers was a different project. But the idea was Kubrick was going to cast Julia Roberts in this film version of The Aryan Papers. You know, this was the Julia that had just, I think she was coming off of either Dying Young or Sleeping with the Enemy, but it was that era Julia Roberts. And when Spielberg moved forward with Schindler's List, and there's nothing of Stanley Kubrick losing his shit, he didn't say anything. There was no negative talk, there was no rage, there was no nothing. He just picked himself up and started working on something else. And the something else was artificial intelligence, which was the project that he was working on and could not get funding for. And then he passed. He only was able to get Eyes Wide Shut done because of the strength of Tom Cruise. And we're seeing Tom Cruise even now putting out word that at this point of his career, yes, Mission Impossible, but he wants to work with what he considers auteur filmmakers. Filmmakers that make distinctive, non-Hollywood product type movies. And Cruise working with Kubrick more than 25 years ago, signing on 28 plus years ago to make Eyes Wide Shut. That was a similar mindset of Tom Cruise. I want to work with a master filmmaker. I always wanted to work with Stanley. And again, Cruise, to his credit, never said anything about the madness. People thought Tom Cruise was taking a break because here it was, he releases 2 movies in 1996, and then 1997 goes forward, and 1998, there's no Tom Cruise movies. What, is he on vacation? No, he's working on a fucking movie with Kubrick, and he's doing 300 takes of every single setup. Stanley didn't always know what he wanted, but he knew what he didn't want. Truer words were never spoken. Spielberg made AI. And I always felt, knowing the things that Kubrick was obsessed with in his movies, he was obsessed with the idea of technology taking over, the concepts of dehumanization, and AI really gets into that. It's kind of a little Blade Runner-ish where you can't tell, is this person human or is this a robot? Like, if you don't know, how are you going to know? And the dehumanization aspect of, for example, 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the fucking robot has more human characteristics than some of the humans. Like, he was a guy who was a big ideas kind of filmmaker. He did not just make normal movies that advance from point A, point B, point C. I mean, I would say of his major films, Full Metal Jacket is the most straightforward. It's the closest to a regular narrative, showing the pathetic absurdity of what was the Vietnam War. And what an absolute waste of everything, from US lives, just to everything. The fact that the soldiers had to be broken down to such a vicious level. They ceased to be humans. They are now perfect killing machines. A little bit too much, as we find out at the end of the incredible first act of boot camp sequence in Full Metal Jacket. But just as a fan, if I am asked the question, what are your 3 favorite films directed by Stanley Kubrick? Well, I believe that A Clockwork Orange was his masterpiece. I think that that was the best movie he ever made. It's an incredible story. It's unbelievably shot. It hits points of pop culture that hadn't happened yet but ended up happening. And there are certain elements that were sci-fi elements in that movie which ended up being real stuff. So he was a forward thinker. He was the kind of person that he could have been a Steve Jobs, an idea guy. He could have worked with Einstein. Allegedly, his IQ was the same as Einstein and Marie Curie and the people of that level. If he hadn't been a filmmaker, he might have split the atom. We'll never know. But we are thankful that he was a filmmaker. But I would put A Clockwork Orange as his finest film. And many people would argue that, 2001: A Space Odyssey, they would put that up there. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a movie that is a 4-star movie, and I respect it. And when I was a little kid, my first exposure to Stanley Kubrick, I was 6 years old, and HBO and Cinemax ran the movie a lot. And I sat there in front of the TV mesmerized. I didn't know what the hell I was looking at. I didn't get the star baby, all that shit at the very, I didn't really get it. But I knew that I was looking at something and images that I had never seen. And really, for a little kid, face pressed up against the TV, special effects were fucking crazy. What he was able to achieve from a practical standpoint made it look like they were in deep space, at least to my young eyes. I love Full Metal Jacket. I love Doctor Strange. I love Doctor Strangelove. And The Shining, it's good. But if you're asking me for a top 3, I'm going to go Clockwork Orange, and I'm going to go Full Metal Jacket, and I think I'm going to go 2001: A Space Odyssey. I feel like most people, that would be what they come up with. There are a lot of people, I remember at the NYU, at the department, the Cinema Studies department, there were people talking up Barry Lyndon, and I remember, Bill Simon, who was the chairman of the department and a Kubrick scholar. He thought that Barry Lyndon was Kubrick's masterpiece and said it was one of the best films. It was one of the best films ever made. Like, he thought it was that good. I mean, I watched the first hour and a half once in one shot, and it bored me to sleep. I could not engage with anything that was going on in that film. But Kubrick did change. He changed the business. His work ethic, his unwavering, resolute need to get every take exactly right. Stanley doesn't know what he wants, but he knows what he doesn't want. And Matthew Modine, who, of course, famously made Full Metal Jacket, which I would have to have in my Kubrick top 3. I've seen it at least 20 times start to finish. I have it as my favorite war movie of all time. And that's one where it's favorite. I'll say that it's the best war movie of all time, showing the sheer horror and terror and chaos of war. And because Vietnam was such a clusterfuck, from that perspective, it works better than even Saving Private Ryan by Stanley's friend. And the two men were really good friends. They didn't see that much of each other, but they spoke on the phone constantly. And for the era, Spielberg talks about, we used to send faxes back and forth all day. And I always loved that. And the reverential way that Spielberg always spoke of Stanley Kubrick. But yeah, the just incredible fuckery that took place, Full Metal Jacket, just an incredible film. But I remember also reading that when Kubrick was trying to get AI made, that Warner Brothers liked the project. And they were going to actually cast Joseph Mazzello, who had been in Jurassic Park with Spielberg, and Kubrick had liked what Spielberg did with Jurassic Park. It was not an easy adaptation. There were certain things he wanted to do, he wasn't able to. But when when Kubrick was preparing AI, the special effects at that time, Warner Brothers was convinced the movie was going to cost $200 million. Stanley, we can't do it. So that was a project that he had wanted to make and wasn't able to. But what I was going to say before I close this is Matthew Modine, who is the lead character in Full Metal Jacket, Private Joker, best performance of Modine's career. He's just incredible, stupendous. When he signed on to do Full Metal Jacket, which is 1987, it came out in the summer, and it was the year after Platoon. And my father, he was in the Army. He was Vietnam era, but he did not go to Vietnam. He was an accountant. He was kept stateside. They need somebody to balance the books, even in the Army, even in wartime. My father's favorite war movie ever was Full Metal Jacket. His second favorite movie was Stalag 17, which is a movie set during war, but not what you would normally consider a war movie because it is not a combat film. But when Matthew Modine signed on to play the lead of the character in the book was called The Short Timers by Gustav Hasford. The character's name is Davis. And there's only one moment in Kubrick's film where you see that this guy's name is Davis. It's during one of the training sequences when they're all wearing like sweaters, like a gray top, where you briefly see the word Davis on Matthew Modine's back. He is just known as Private Joker. When Modine signed on, he supposedly sent a cable to Jack Nicholson. I don't know if he knew Jack, whether they were on, that part I don't remember because Modine's book called Full Metal Jacket Diary, he gets into it. I don't know if he knew Jack that well beforehand, but he basically asked Jack, I've heard stories about you and Stanley on The Shining. Can you give me any input how I can prepare as an actor? He said something like that. And Nicholson sent a letter, cable, fax. It wouldn't have been a fax. It could have been a telex. But he said something to the effect of, it takes Stanley at least 100 takes to figure out what you can do. It takes him another 100 takes for him to figure out what he definitely doesn't want from this particular shot or scene. The third 100 takes, he has a better idea. What he was telling him is, kid, prepare to do hundreds of takes of every scene. Just give yourself over to it. You're going to probably be making really good money. Don't ever expect anything to go at more than a glacial pace. It's just how he works. And part of the reason why Jack's character, you feel his madness, is probably because Jack, the actor, was going fucking nuts shooting so many takes. But Stanley always got what he wanted, and he was a perfectionist. And in every moment, every single shot, you could just watch Full Metal Jacket and just the dolly shots, the tracking shots, his frame compositions. Nobody's ever done it better. Again, Christopher Nolan is close. He certainly has the chops and the talent. But the way that Kubrick has the camera in a certain position, you feel like it is genius in motion. And so in Full Metal Jacket, every shot in the film could be a painting. Every single shot is so perfectly staged, arranged. Action. Cut. Magnificent. And it was a difficult shoot. And, Modine he had the head shaved and then with the hair. It was a very difficult shoot. Probably no one had a good time on the movie. And it didn't do as well with critics as was expected. Because of Kubrick, you certainly would have expected Oscar nominations across the board. I think it got a nomination for adapted screenplay, but it didn't hit critics the way that it may otherwise have, because Oliver Stone's Platoon had come out the previous year, and that was a more standard war movie combat type of film. And it dealt with very upsetting themes, but different upsetting themes. Because I would argue that Full Metal Jacket, in his way, it's more upsetting. But that's a semantics kind of an argument. I am, as many cineasts, am sad that Kubrick did not get to have the late era that not really contemporaries, he was older than them, but the older filmmakers that we see today, such as Spielberg, such as Scorsese, such as George Lucas, Excuse me, not Lucas, because Lucas doesn't really. I meant to say Coppola. Those are the three: Coppola, and Scorsese, and Spielberg. Scorsese now, I believe he's 81, and Coppola's 83, and they're still working. And who knows if Coppola's Megalopolis is going to be any good, but the fact that he was finally able to get that movie through, even with all the money that Francis Coppola is worth, the vineyards have been turning a profit for how many decades? It took that long. And we're all blessed, even if the film is not altogether successful, because he's been working. 20 years ago, he was talking about Megalopolis. I feel like he was talking about it in the 90s when he made Jack with Robin Williams, which was not very good. But Stanley, unfortunately, Eyes Wide Shut was his final film. And he had just finished editing it. As I said, whether or not it was the cut that went to theaters or whether they doctored it after he passed, it's not important. We got to see what his vision was for that film. Do I have it in my Kubrick top 5? Yeah, maybe. As I say, I'm not a huge fan of Barry Lyndon. I like The Shining. It's not one of my favorite horror films. Dr. Strangelove would probably have to be in the top 5. It's so fucking crazy. Very prescient also. But there was just nobody like him. There was nobody like Kubrick. How much of a workaholic he was, how much of a perfectionist, because every filmmaker is a perfectionist. Stanley was a perfectionist. And that is something that he will always be known for. And he left a really favorable impression on the people who knew him best. And Steven Spielberg, if Spielberg had a problem with you, he wasn't going to associate with you. This was not just an adoration or, well, he treats me like, no, they had a real friendship. And Spielberg doing AI was a great parting gift, a final gift to Stanley and to the cinematic world, because it, to me, is one of Spielberg's strongest films because it has darker themes than most of Steven Spielberg's work. And I'm not talking about the fact that War of the Worlds was a pretty brutal movie. I mean, from a thematic standpoint, AI is not a movie that you would have expected Spielberg to make. And he did. And we're all grateful. Sad that Stanley's gone, but grateful that at least one of his unrealized projects was realized by a filmmaker who had the talent to do justice to it. We'll never know what a 1995 AI with Joseph Mazzello in the Haley Joel Osment role from the Spielberg film, we'll never know how the film would have been. But what we got from Spielberg is really, really good science fiction. And certainly among Spielberg's top 3, for me, science fiction films, and he's made a lot of great ones. Stanley Kubrick, July 26, 1928, in the Bronx, New York, born, passed March 7, 1999, across the pond in England, where he made his life for at least the last 4 decades, between 3 and 4 decades. Bronx boy ended up spending the rest of his life in England. Gone at 70, 25 years ago today, but never, ever forgotten, revered for all time. And with that, we've reached the end of episode number 111 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me once again. I get emotional when I'm talking about the greats like a Kubrick. I apologize. But if you checked out episode 111 on the YouTube channel, enjoyed the content, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, turn on those notifications. Or if maybe you're in the car, you're at the gym, you're just chilling, and you happen to listen to this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes and haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode number 112 real soon. Until then, peace.